Those words from Kipling have been a part of my life since I was about 13. My dad gifted me that poem. I'm looking at it over my shoulder as I'm blinded by the sun moving across the sky in my window. It's quite beautiful, but uh, I get to look at it and read it every morning as I'm going through my morning routine, and especially now, it's March 2nd. We're in the midst of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. President Biden just had his State of the Union address, and there are some things going on in the world and even in my own life that are challenging to say the least. And they can seem big and scary and so far out of our control for so many of us. And I think it begs a question that I thought was perfect to start with for this first episode. It was a question that was posed to me by someone who has inspired me immensely since I discovered his work several years ago. I really deeply encourage you all to check out his work. His name is Paul Chek. I first encountered him in the health and fitness space, but his work really does transcend all that. I mean, he has redefined what it means to be a healthy soul, and emphasis on soul. And one of the many questions he encourages people to ask themselves, which I pose to you all today, and which I'm going to try to reason through and give you some things that have come to me when I've meditated on it, is the question of what would courage do? And it seems appropriate given the uncertainty and some of the palpable fear that is circulating out there. I try to resist that. Doesn't mean I'm ignorant to it. And that's why I wanted to speak to it today. And when I started to meditate on that question in my quieter moments, one of the first things that came to me was that in answer to that question of what would courage do, to put it into action, I think we have to step out of the path of least resistance. And that answer came to me at a time when I was reading the book Attachments by Father Anthony de Mello. Father Anthony de Mello was a Jesuit priest from India. He's someone I certainly wish was still around at this time to speak on what's going on in the world and maybe help us better navigate some of our feelings and intuitions. But the concept of awareness has to do, according to him, first and foremost with dropping some of our attachments. And I like the word choice of dropping attachments as opposed to letting them go. Because if you think of letting something go, you might set it down gently, you might relinquish it slowly and patiently and only when it's convenient. But to drop something is to let it shatter on the ground and you can leave it in your wake and ride off into the sunset. And I think that's profound because it gravely compelled me to look at some of my own attachments. Uh, a lot of this is ego related. And when I think of my attachments in the past to, and they're not totally behind me, but I have committed to dropping them uh, because of the resistance that they put up. And attachments such as, do people like me? Are people doing the things that I'm preaching and modeling? Um, am I attached to my possessions? Am I attached to things that promote an image of success? That's something I've really had to grapple with. And I think in dropping attachments and becoming more aware, we get to know the freedom that allows us to see danger. If we're already stressed and fearful, anything can look like danger, but at the same time, perhaps we're numb to it. And I have that concern now, given the state of the last couple of years and how many perceived threats we've had to encounter and idealize, and not a lot of it has been fully understood. But in the midst of any sort of turmoil, I think it's critical to have that freedom of spirit and mind to be able to say, this is a threat, and therefore what is my response to that? And there's a lot of, we're talking about courage, and I think there's a lot of courage that goes into problem solving when the straits are dire. And as we know, Einstein said that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. There are some problems out there that seem to be fabricated from fear. And there's an element of violence in the world that seems to have its origins in fear. People think violence then inspires fear, but I'm not convinced of that. That's not something that's obvious to me. And so when I think of the path of least resistance, there are so many things I've come to realize through great difficulty and a lot of resistance in my sphere of things that I would like to see done differently, things that I've had to do differently for myself. But even as someone who values tradition as much as I do, especially within my family and some of the things that we hold dearest, there's a lot of momentum behind that. And I'm talking about the kind of momentum that trickles down to us because our parents did something that their parents raised them to do, that their parents raised them to do, and et cetera, et cetera. And those things that when you step back and try to reason or rationalize them, you may happen upon the realization to say, wow, that really doesn't make sense. I mean, that seems so counterintuitive. And I know a lot of those particular nuances can be very personal. So I'll leave that to your own devices to look through. But some of my own have been pretty earth shattering. And that I harken back to Father de Mello because that's been a hallmark of when I read his works and say, it's these things are earth shattering in a good way because you wake up and you have an alertness and a freshness of mind that is I have to say my own journey of watching myself and really honoring that self-awareness. It's been the greatest adventure I've ever been on, and that's not an overstatement because it's a daily one. It's a very sustainable one, and it really it bolsters my ability to look for ways to step out of this path of least resistance and to it's not always in an effort to stand out from the crowd, but it's especially at this moment that I think it's apropos to read to you some words from Bruce Lee's philosophy book, The Tao of Jeet Kune Do. And I'm so happy I stumbled upon this work. And despite not being a martial artist, I was really drawn to Bruce Lee's story. An example, I mean, he was such a flicker of light that it's that classic adage of the brightest lights burn so quickly and then die out just as quickly. And again, he's someone who could have had a greater impact on the world if he didn't. It's argued that he basically worked himself to death out of the fervor that he had for his life and his craft as an actor and martial artist. But these are some very strong words from Bruce Lee, and I want to share them with you now. There is a powerful craving in most of us to see ourselves as instruments in the hands of others, and thus free ourselves from responsibility for acts which are prompted by our own questionable inclinations and impulses. Both the strong and the weak grasp at this alibi. The latter hide their malevolence under the virtue of obedience. The strong, too, claim absolution by proclaiming themselves the chosen instruments of a higher power God, history, fate, nation, or humanity. Similarly, we have more faith in what we imitate than in what we originate. We cannot derive a sense of absolute certitude from anything which has its roots in us. The most poignant sense of insecurity comes from standing alone, and we are not alone when we imitate. It is thus with most of us. We are what we are what other people say we are, and we know ourselves chiefly by hearsay. To become different from what we are, we must have some awareness of what we are. Whether this being different results in dissimulation or a real change of heart, it cannot be realized without self-awareness. Yet it is remarkable that the very people who are most self-dissatisfied, who crave most for a new identity, have the least self-awareness. They have turned away from an unwanted self and hence never had a good look at it. The result is that most dissatisfied people can neither dissimulate nor attain a real change of heart. They are transparent, and their unwanted qualities persist through all attempts at self-dramatization and self-transformation. It is the lack of self-awareness which renders us transparent. The soul that knows itself is opaque. Some strong words there from the great Bruce Lee. Uh, but especially that part about imitation, and we're not alone when we're imitating the crowd. That is how we end up still going along the path of least resistance, and that's why I encourage you to consider, when you ask yourself, what does courage look like for me? It probably does not exist in doing what everyone else is doing. I heard John Danaher, the great world-class jiu-jitsu coach, say that it's both ignorant and arrogant to do things just like everyone else is doing them and expect to get a different result because you're special or unique just by dint of your birth. And that rings true, especially when we ask ourselves, what does courage look like if I'm to act on it? And one of those actions, which there are scarce examples of it now, but through history and through especially religious stories, we know that one act of courage that we can bring about is sacrifice. And I alluded to the religious example. I was raised Catholic, and I can honestly say I did not feel harmed by my Catholic upbringing or anything like that. I'm actually quite grateful for it. Grew up through Catholic school, uh, had instilled in me, in not always the punitive nature of, if you don't do this, you're going to hell. I just assume I'm ending up there and hope to see some of you there. But it was more so the virtues of Christianity, of compassion, kindness, charity, things like that, faith, hope, love, that have stuck with me. And regardless of how you feel about religion, we can value those stories as archetypes and models. And the example of Jesus Christ, willingly, even though he asked his father, Lord, can you take this burden from me, this responsibility from me, and still giving himself up to suffering and death. Uh, Tough to beat that story of courage. Of course, we have great heroes who we look to for that example, but I think we've come to know that it depends on quote unquote regular people to enact courageous virtue and sacrifice in order to bring about change. And I'll make the distinction here between reckless and reasoned sacrifice, because there's, of course, you hear combat veterans talk about how critical fear is to acknowledge. To be fearless, devoid of any sense of repercussion or loss of life, that usually does not, that brings about some hubris that we should not necessarily emulate. I think there's an element of sacrifice, if it's reasoned, that understands the profundity of what that action is, of if you're laying down your life or your livelihood for a cause or a person, or in the face of some injustice, the gravity is not lost on you. And it also, I think maybe it brings about some caution and some thoughtfulness instead of that recklessness where you just throw yourself into something. And I think another time I'll speak to my own experience with this. Granted, I'm 27 years old. I don't know the sacrifices of raising a family. Uh, Again, a discussion for another time. But I think in a relationship, I've been in my relationship for almost 9 years now, and there are sacrifices that go along with that. I still firmly believe that you can grow alongside someone, and as we've heard, still ensure your own happiness and your own contentment. But ideally, it's I remember talking to my counselor about this. We were talking about a balance, and everyone always preaches balance and everything, but if you're seeing the video now, you can see the balance of scales going up and down. But I remember my counselor telling me that you can pursue balance, but if you're with the right person, you just mesh, and then everything you do is genuinely together. And so the sacrifices are then reciprocated, they're understood, they're deeply felt. um, but I think one of the things that holds people back from understanding sacrifice and thinking that we're called to sacrifice ourselves is that we know the soul's greatest addiction is to matter. And It's tough to tell your soul, hey man, I got to drop you for a second, or you may have to take a big hit because there's something more important than you. And I still believe that's a short list of things more important than your life. Um, I'm still working through that. I mean, I've been forced to make some sacrifices, and I say forced just based on external circumstances, but I took that as my opportunity to prove my mettle. And if I'm the man of who honors his values that I think I am, then it was time to walk the walk. And part of sacrifice again is determining what causes are worth that, which people are worth that. Because if it's universal, that's a very saintly value, perhaps you could say. But I think there's something about that dilutes the meaning of a sacrifice if you're just willing to give it up for any old thing or any old person. But there's a dearness that needs to be known there as well. And when we think of this dearness and when we put ourselves on the line, there's a third facet of courage and action that again I'm still trying to understand myself, but it's something that came to me in a moment of meditation, and that element is to embrace compassion. And my it wasn't it didn't immediately resonate with me because my first reaction was, damn, that's hard to be consistently compassionate, especially after, we're talking about this in the context of after these two steps that I've devised, of after you've broken away from the crowd and stepped off the path of least resistance. Perhaps you've sacrificed and you're reeling from that sacrifice and how it's changed your life. Where does compassion fit in? I mean, that seems so hard, especially if you have people who are capitalizing on your misfortune or in opposition to you. And I just find myself asking, like, why is my reaction that this is too hard to embrace compassion? And clearly my religious values weren't enough to say, oh yeah, that makes sense, I can do that. It's a different, to say I understand that is different than I can live that and put it into practice. And maybe you struggle with that too. Maybe you see the struggle in constantly embracing compassion when it's easier to be petty, angry, resentful, or indifferent. Indifference is brutal in some of these circumstances, to not feel and to not have an emotional response. Um, but there's an element of ego here as well in compassion, and I think that can often keep us from softening our hearts. And I know this from personal experience of I've gone through so many different revelations and iterations of understanding my own ego. And I think the place I've landed is to be good friends with it. Really get to know your ego. Really have some conversations with him or her so that that dialogue is potent. Um, because as we know, I mean, it's a comparison metric. It's how we know ourselves in relation to other people, other circumstances, other times, and it reifies our self-image and then how we seek to uphold that in the world. Uh, it's actually, again, if you're watching the video, it's pretty poetic that right now the sun shadow is splitting my face in two, because you I believe that you can be both your ego and a timeless soul. There's a beautiful quote, again, something I heard from Paul Chek, which was, I think it was Osho who said that you are not a drop in the ocean, you are the ocean in a drop. And you can hear that and use that drop to grossly inflate your ego and fill up your cup of importance. But I don't think that's what it means. I think it has more to do with the connection that we feel to other people, and that we are the containment of so many lives. And again, our we know these, we've come to know these things about our genetic coding, that there are things that we cannot explain, and yet we know them deep within us, right? And we have those gut reactions. My parents raised me on the mantra of trust your gut, and I've I just the other day, I had that feeling, that gut reaction of there's a pit in my stomach, and I know this is uncomfortable, and I'm trying to navigate my way through this difficult situation. And sometimes, just based on that physiological response, we do know some answers. But in understanding the ego, it's a lot of it is about judgment, and both self-judgment and judgment of others. And the ego doesn't like to concede control. That's another part of it too. So when you're compassionate in the face of toil or bad luck or what have you, it demands a lot to soften your heart and think more on an emotional response versus an emotional reaction. You know the, I want to refine this point and say that I try to choose my words carefully. It's something I'll do my best to work on as a skill in this podcast. And that's why I'm going to value the feedback I get from you, my family and friends, people listening to this. If you care enough to share with me, and I hope you do, because uh, our language, I've always been so fascinated by language. That started when I was homeschooling. Shout out to my mom, who painstakingly took the time out of her life to educate myself and my sister. And one of my first real affinities was for reading and writing. And I'm so glad I found my way back to that, because our language is so much richer than we give it credit for. And just making that distinction between a response versus a reaction is, a response is more thoughtful and perhaps more intuitive. Reactions, as we know, subconscious, and they may seem out of our control, but we can train them. But when it comes to these ego reactions of when we feel discomfort or we feel a challenge coming on, and if our emotional reaction is to harden our hearts and to be rigid, it makes it really hard to be courageous enough to do things differently and to communicate that to others and try to turn around the momentum that can drive us toward ruin and folly. And I want to close in recapping some of this, but one sentiment that stuck in my mind as well, because I always catch myself saying, I hope this and I hope that, and especially in the last 2 years when we've been looking ahead. And I think it bears stating that hope is not a strategy. It's a beautiful thing to have, and I can't imagine life without it. It's one of those principal virtues that we learn when we're young, and there's a lot of hope I still maintain internally, but it's not a strategy. You didn't hear me list that as one of these facets of understanding what would courage do. Hope is insufficient. And I think when we ask ourselves this question of how we bring about courage in action, one thing that strikes me as well is that there's a surprising feeling of gratitude for the evil that opposes us and really necessitates courage. And what I mean by that is something that I encounter reading the work of Alan Watts. And he talks so much about and writes so much about polarity, and that we have been tricked into thinking that life is a battle where good needs to win out over evil, and we need to conquer evil once and for all. And if you're a student of history or remotely awake, you know that battle rages on. In fact, quite literally in some circumstances. I don't have the geopolitical savvy to weigh in on what whose side is which in this Russia-Ukraine conflict or anything going on right now. But suffice it to say, we don't know light without dark. We don't understand good without evil. We don't know on without off. And so that polarity, if you're if I can trust my gut here, there's a gratitude that I feel from my own experience that has, as I said, really compelled me to test my own sense of value and courage and sacrifice and compassion, because without it, there might be no test. If there's no adversity, how are we going to know what we're capable of? And so to embrace a certain gratitude for the evils and the ne'er do wells in the world, uh, I think it helps us seek the polarity that is required to bring about change. So when you encounter an evil or an opposition, uh, it's certainly easy to be bogged down by and mired by that. But I'd urge you to start asking these questions of yourselves: of what would courage do? What would love do? What would compassion do? What would honor do? Um, because I think it will help us understand where we go from here. And I don't have every answer to that, but it's it's a wonderful adventure again for me to engage with it here and talk through it aloud. I think this is how we know if our thoughts and feelings are reality, is when we speak them into existence and see what kind of feedback we get from the world and from people. So I hope that this has been useful to you. That's not my strategy, but it's a sincere wish that I have to, as I said, continue building my skill in communicating my own thoughts and seeing how they resonate with you all. Uh, we'll be doing this again very soon, but in the meantime, I think we have a lot to think about. And I'm reminded that men and women of abstraction and action need to link up. We can't just be in our own heads or recklessly acting all the time. We need that synergy. And it starts with these questions. And the answers are not always clear. I'm hoping that some of these are close to the mark, but I would love to hear from you all and see what you think about this time, how you determine what courage means to you and what it asks of you. And until then, I'd like to offer one final reminder that is constantly on my mind these days, that it's human being for a reason. Not human thinking, not human doing, not human working. It's human being. So when you're in a moment of quiet following this podcast, or winding down for your evening or starting your day, take that time to understand your being and ask your soul these questions. And when you start to devise some answers, I wouldn't begin to declare how you'll know, but from my own interaction, silence is usually a pretty good indicator. So, uh, thank you for sharing this time and space with me. And I wish you profound understanding of yourself, and may you come to know what courage looks like in your own life. And until next time, it's been a pleasure.